Today, we're honoured to be joined by multi-award-winning journalist, author, and filmmaker Shannon Harvey. She's the creator of two internationally acclaimed documentaries, The Connection, Mind Your Body, and My Year of Living Mindfully. Also an excellent book. I can highly recommend that one if you haven't yet read it. She's also written My Whole Health Life. She's a font of information about living mindfully and the connection with a creative practice as well. So I'm very excited to hear this conversation. Craig, Shannon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Megan. And thank you, Shannon. It's great to be with you today. And I'm very happy to reverse the tables. This time you're not the interviewer, but you're going to be interviewed. So welcome. And I should mention as well, Shannon, that you've been a wonderful contributor as well on the advisory committee for M3CS as well, which we deeply appreciate.
That's my pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Shannon, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I'll just read something from your website, though. I'm a journalist on a mission to elevate necessary conversations about health and well-being to the forefront of public conversation. I believe that great stories can be the heartbeat of a movement to change minds, change lives, and change policy. You go on to say, compelling true stories and in-depth reporting on the science-backed solutions that can turn the tide on an epidemic of preventable chronic disease. So I'm very interested not only to explore a bit about mindfulness, but also the importance of storytelling. Now, I know that, and you don't often like to sort of highlight it, but you've got quite a compelling sort of story in your own life of your own journey through, illness and recovery that really was the catalyst in many ways for the sort of direction that you headed your journalistic sort of life in. Can you tell us a little bit about your own story and how that culminated in the work that you do, Shannon?
Sure. I guess I was working as what you would call a mainstream journalist. I was working for the ABC as what was back then called a bi-media journalist, doing news and current affairs, radio and television reporting. I like to joke that I was the Northwest Tasmania correspondent for the ABC. I was the only news journalist based in Northwest Tassie. And I was 24 and I had hopes of being a foreign correspondent and being a journalist. And then I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. At the time, the specialist doctor felt that it was an illness called lupus. And he told me that, if this disease progresses, then I could expect to be in a wheelchair before I was 30. And it was a really devastating blow, that diagnosis. But I was young and I, threw everything I had at it. And I spent a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars, on anybody who promised me a cure for that illness. Everything from advanced allergy elimination to every alternative therapy under the sun and everything that the doctors had prescribed as well. And nothing worked. And yeah, Craig, this is a story that you're probably sick of me telling, but I remember I was on page 20 or 30 of a Google search many years later after the diagnosis, and I stumbled across a document that you had prepared for Monash medical students. And in that document, you had summarised all the evidence demonstrating that when it comes to chronic disease, we really need to take a mind-body approach. And you outlined all the pioneering work of people like John Kabat-Zinn, Herbert Benson, Dean Ornish. And I remember I had my highlighter, still have highlighters constantly. And I just went through that paper line by line, and then I read up every single paper that you had referenced. And then I traveled the world and I interviewed all those people that you mentioned in that document. And that was the beginning of my first film, The Connection. And that really set me on this path that I'm on now. Yeah.
So this is really well, I suppose it's not just an intellectual interest for you. It seems to have also fired a passion in you to help others, to inform their own story and search for health and healing as well.
One of the big frustrations that I have with the work that I do, actually, Craig, is that this is not common knowledge. That people I still speak to, socially, and that, you have that conversation of what do you do, and you talk about, this mission that I feel that I'm on, and people are still really surprised by it. And I can't, that still frustrates me a lot. And I feel in some ways that we all have a right to know this, because I think that a lot of suffering would be avoided if this information, which is, this is hard evidence that we've got, when we're talking about the connection between our mind, body, and our health. This is not airy fairy stuff. This is hard evidence. And one of the things that you and I often talk about is that it takes 17 years for a new discovery to be implemented in mainstream medical practice. And I just think that's so wrong. Once something has been proven to be true, I think we as a people should have immediate access to it. Yeah.
Well, I dare say there's always a nuancing of understanding the evidence better and the mechanisms and the optimal kinds of approaches that work best, etc. But the basic principle that the mind affects the body would seem to be reasonably obvious. And all the people you've spoken to over the years, what kinds of reasons can you explain for this resistance to the notion that the mind influences the body as profoundly as it does?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't come across the resistance anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's really interesting, is that it's almost like we actually all know it intuitively, that things like our emotions can actually have a palpable impact throughout our body. We just know that to be true. And so it's not so much a resistance, but it's more like a big, slow moving behemoth, that things have always been done this way and therefore we still do them this way. And so, yeah, it's almost like we need to just keep chipping away at it. And then one day we'll wake up and we'll be there, whatever there means. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
turning an ocean liner at spin the wheel, but the thing doesn't turn very quickly.
That's exactly right. And if you think about, it was probably about 15 years ago that I started this work, and I feel like the ocean liner had not turned at that point, but the turn is definitely on. Yeah. Yeah.
We often talk, you're a passionate storyteller, and we often talk about stories having a moral or a message or some kind of lesson embodied in them. If there was a lesson to your story, your experience, what would that be?
One single lesson.
Well, you can start with one and then maybe top 10.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that I cannot just sum everything up in one single, concept, because there's so many lessons.
Are there a couple that sort of come to mind that sort of stand out for yourself that were, and I dare say lessons, I mean, things about life, about yourself that you learned from this challenging experience that you had?
I think the really big change for me was turning towards evidence. I can't emphasize enough how non-evidence-based I was at the age of 24. And you would think, as somebody who's trained as a journalist to think critically and objectively, you would think that that would come naturally, but it didn't. It did. It took me so many years for me to think, hey, why don't I apply the same level of rigor to my own health as I do to to my work? It took me a long time to put those two together. But for me, the fundamental change in my well-being, and I mean that physically with my well-being, like I still have an autoimmune disease, but I live very well with that illness. And also my emotional well-being as well. That putting that layer of evidence-based practice over everything, I attribute to being the single most important thing that has made a difference in my physical and mental well-being. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to
And it
really,
sounds really boring. That's the problem, is that no, yeah, I'm an evidence-based health journalist. It just sounds so boring to people, which I guess is where the storytelling is really important. Yeah.
well, I think I've only known you since you've been very much on this kind of path. And that's certainly one of the things that I very much admire about the work that you do, because not every journalist is necessarily really trying to understand the evidence and really trying to explain it in a way that's accessible to people, and not trying to push, a story where the evidence doesn't lead, so that kind of rigor, I must admit, I think is well, a tremendous boon to health journalism, because a lot of the things that wind up in the popular press, etc., are not always the most based on evidence, or sometimes there's press releases that are sent out and they're turned into something as if they're a story rather than advertising for something. And so that rigor's not always there. I mean, that's pretty important in itself.
And it is something that is, I would say, the absolute foundation of everything I do, to a fault, to be honest. Like, I've been working on my new film, which is called Raising Superheroes, and it's tackling the idea of whether it asks the question about whether or not mental illness is preventable. And it's looking at, starting with mental illness, starting by rather than treating people once they're already ill, but rather starting where mental illness begins, which is in childhood for the vast majority of people. And the film, I've been working on it for 3 years now. And the reason why is that when I started the film and I had all my kind of synopses and all my pitch material ready, but that where I thought the film was going is not where the film has ended up. The evidence has taken me down a completely and utterly surprising direction that I still don't even yet fully know how to communicate to the wider population. But the temptation with journalism and storytelling of any kind is that you've got a deadline, you've got to get it out, you've got to, there's expectations, but I just can't do that. I can't put something out that I know not to be true. Yeah, yeah.
Without it being a spoiler alert, or maybe just as a because what you just said there is really interesting. What have you discovered that has changed the course or the direction of this new documentary you're making? You happy to say a little bit about, what are these a few of these kinds of realizations you've had?
I guess, I mean, it's good to talk to you about this too, Craig, especially at this early stage of, the film's not out yet. It's in production. But it all started really with my last film, My Year of Living Mindfully, when Willem Kuyken, who's a professor at Oxford University, explained to me that the vast majority of mental illness begins, in childhood, whether it's as a young child or as a teenager, when the brain is still, our brains are not fully, especially if it's a male brain, our brains are not fully developed until the age of 24. And so really the question was, what happens to us at that age that can set us up for the rest of our lives? Because of course, if you experience mental illness from a young age, there's a high chance that you'll experience it again as an adult, and a high chance, that you'll experience it recurringly throughout your lifetime. And so I everything that I've done to date has been about what we as an individual can do. What can I, Shannon Harvey, who's diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, do to change my life in order to live well? And then to share that information with other people. But the really big takeaway for me is that the kids can't do anything. You know, that we as the adults are actually responsible for what happens to them in childhood. And so this is not a story about teaching children the perfect sleep meditation or a story about any single thing that a child can do, or even a single thing that any single parent can do for their child. But it's actually a bigger story about systemic change. So it's taking a really surprising direction. Yeah. And it doesn't drill down to nice little, 10 takeaways yet. I'll get there. Yeah. Yeah.
So, what sorts of things are happening on a systemic level that are pushing us collectively down this sort of path towards less than optimal mental health?
Well, there's many causes of mental illness. One of the famous causes that we now have so much evidence on is this thing called the ACEs, the childhood ACEs, adverse childhood events. And I think there's something like 10 adverse childhood events that if they occur to you, as a child, you're significantly more likely to not only suffer from mental illness later in life, but also from chronic diseases as well, things like heart disease and diabetes. And Craig, you and I have often talked about, the mechanisms that can explain how emotional well-being can impact you physically. And it is as simple as the stress response. That a child who is chronically stressed is, of course, going to have these physical reactions that are going to have implications later on in their lives. So there's that kind of mechanistic explanation that we can talk about. But it's bigger than that too. Anybody who's got young children who might be listening to this will know that it's really hard raising kids at the moment in this world that we're living in. It is so difficult. Everything from the cost of living, but also, just to be really clear, I'm a feminist. I really believe, that women should be out there working and being fulfilled. But two parents at work, which is the norm in my generation, puts enormous pressure on families and young children. But we're now in this situation in society where two parents have to work in order to survive. And we just don't have infrastructure to support that. I mean, when you think about it logically, and I'm just talking about the Australian context, not the global context, but who came up with the idea that school should be from 9 a.m. till 3 p.m.? Parents are supposed to start work at 9 p.m. and finish work at 5 p.m. Like that one stressor just puts so much pressure on people. And I can go on and on and on. We can look at it from an individual, from a baby, we can look at it from so many different perspectives. But really, I think what I'm trying to say here, I'm resisting the urge to summarize everything, but really what I'm trying to say here is we need to bring back this concept of the village. And rather than thinking of ourselves as these little silos, in our little houses with our four walls, we actually need to start thinking about the fact that we as the adults need to take responsibility for young kids. This is going in a very surprising direction, Craig. I wasn't sure that we were going to talk about that. I thought we were going to be talking about mindfulness.
Well, I didn't know what direction the conversation would take, Shannon, so I hope you're happy going there.
Yeah.
but this it will, in a kind of a way, this may not just be an individual, when you mentioned mindfulness, and individually we can become more or less mindful depending on what we do. But it seems like that this is perhaps, is this a systemic thing as well? We're kind of sleepwalking through life and so on, that there's a collective waking up that needs to happen?
Definitely. I might tell a little story because I think stories help. And you were there when this happened. You and I were, this was after The Connection had been released. And I think it was a bank. It was a bank in Sydney, invited both of us to present, um, uh, a little, the film was screened, and then there was a Q&A amongst the staff. And this organization was really wanting to, bring mind-body information to the workforce. And I remember a woman came up to both of us at the end. I was very new in this field at the time. And this young woman came up and she said, look, what you've just said about the stress response is so interesting. And I'm definitely constantly chronically stressed all the time. And she said, but do you realize that here in this organization, you are expected to do a 12-hour workday, and that they reward you if you work past 8 p.m. at night by buying you dinner? And she said, like, what do you think, about that? Like, and I just remember because at this stage, my level of understanding and knowledge was all about stress response and you as an individual. And I just thought, what do I do with this? And I remember, Craig, you turned to that woman and you said, look, maybe you need to think about the job. Like, maybe it's not you, maybe it's the external forces around you. And so I think that little story just does demonstrate that there is a lot that we can do as an individual. But sometimes, the broader, the water that we are swimming in or the air that we are breathing is the polluted thing. It's not us as an individual that's failing. And so, yeah, I do think, coming back to your point about us sleepwalking, I think it takes a lot of bravery to wake up and to step away and to do things differently. But the benefits, pay off.
It's one thing, certainly I've noticed in my own life as well, and certainly working with people for many different years, that we can be in a situation, and sometimes, there are situations in the world going on that people can't step away from for various reasons. But sometimes there's also the situation where that sense of being trapped is that our thinking is trapped and fixed, and we just don't even consider or see any other options. And we feel trapped in a situation. It could be a job, for example, that every fibre in our being is telling us this is not, my life path, or this is really not serving me well. And yet we don't think to look elsewhere or open our eyes, lift our head, that sense of being personally trapped, rather than, that. And I think Viktor Frankl talked about that as being that kind of the ultimate freedom, as to being able to choose our own way. Mm. How do we respond in that situation? Mm. Was that one of the things that came up for you, that getting a bad diagnosis, and rather than feeling trapped or restricted, to actually think, well, wait a sec, I have some agency here. I can make some choices. I'm not powerless in the situation.
100%. I remember the day so clearly when that doctor first diagnosed me, and he said, not only, if this disease progresses, you could end up in a wheelchair, but, you might also have trouble having children, and then he gave me a story of one of his patients who's having trouble getting pregnant, and, this sense of, and there's nothing you can do, that we don't know what causes it, and there is no known cure. Here's some steroids that will suppress your immune system and be off with you then. And there was a real sense of hopelessness there, definitely. And then that's why, as I said earlier, that's why I turned to all the alternatives, because I felt like at least I could try something, at least I could do something, but it was really, though, the conclusion from making The Connection, and then later writing my first book, which was called The Whole Health Life. The conclusion is that by using all the evidence, there is actually so much we can do. There is so much that is within our control, but a lot of it takes bravery. A lot of it, again, back then, I was a real workaholic. I think I was running away from things in my past by trying to succeed and win at life. And it takes a lot of bravery to say no to that, when it's how you've always been your whole life. Yeah. But also the payoff is so worth it. So just, yeah, if anybody's listening to this and wondering whether they need to make a change and they themselves know that it's time, then I would say just take the leap. Definitely you'll never regret it ever. Yeah.
It's something I've seen quite a lot. You've featured in one of your documentaries the work of Professor George Jelinek and the work he's done with multiple sclerosis. And and for those on the call who don't know about George, he was, I think, the first professor of emergency medicine in Australasia, editor of an international medical journal, pretty smart cookie, I think you'd probably say. And in his mid-40s, at the height of his career, I think you'd probably say a workaholic as well. He gets a diagnosis of MS. And with his family history, with his scans, with his symptoms, with the progression of the illness in the early stages, it wasn't a good prognosis. I think he had a similar kind of experience when he was diagnosed and the news that was delivered and the way it was delivered. But I think a couple of days after him feeling like that, he said, wait a sec, I know how to search for evidence. So he poured over, I think it was about 20,000 studies or something. He searched the literature, trying to sift out the better from the less good, and then came up with 7 things, which formed the basis of his program that he put himself on. Now, mind you, must be about 25 years ago, and he's a picture of health. But this sort of sense of agency, I can be an active participant in my own healthcare. Is that something that you see a lot, that sometimes the way news is given, and we're not talking here about wishful thinking or trying to pretend or deny, if there's a serious condition, there's a condition that needs to be addressed, but you're talking about evidence, but do we do enough to empower and engage people in their own healthcare, in the healthcare system?
Absolutely not. We definitely don't do that. And that, we really, in the future, in my dream world, there would be this whole entire workforce of people. I don't know what they're going to be called. Craig, you can come up with a good name. You're good at this sort of thing. But these people are like our coaches, that are built into the medical system, that can show us, that can empower us down the right paths, rather than what so many of us do, which is sort of flap around like a trout, outside the stream, trying to work out what we're supposed to be doing. But, imagine an entire workforce of people who could, steer us in the right direction, put us in touch with the right people, give us the right reference material, for our own individual concerns. Wouldn't that be fabulous?
Yes, I've long had a vision of that being a part of the hospital system and also community healthcare as well. So when somebody gets a diagnosis, the oncologist, the cardiologist can say, here's the medical path we're mapping out for you, the best treatments available for you. Now, here's what else you can do for yourself. And here's somebody who's going to be able to talk to you all about all of these other elements of your lifestyle and your mental health and well-being. And we're going to work together to get the best overall outcome. That's a dream I have as well.
Wouldn't that be amazing? And I've just, because I'm researching this new film, in the Netherlands, they have that from the moment a child is born. In terms of pediatric care, there is like a health coach that is given to that child, that, regardless of what that child's circumstances are. And then if some child needs some specialist care of some sort, then they're guided to the right place. And, perhaps that's one of the reasons why, the Netherlands consistently ranks is, one of the, happiest children on the planet.
Yes. What with that and the charity that was founded from that work of George Jelinek and on MS was Overcoming MS, and the person who basically set that charity up to support that kind of work, Linda, she she got MS, very disabled with the condition. Again, she was in her 20s, a psychology student at the time. And I remember telling her story about realizing there's things she could do, putting it into effect. And here she is 20 years later with children and leading an incredible life, and really has founded this worldwide charity to support this kind of work. So an amazing story in itself. But I remember her saying that when she was starting to recover and she was getting to the point of doing her psychology thesis, she said, I suppose I should do it on post-traumatic stress, considering what's been happening to me the last couple of years. And all of a sudden she said, I had this moment of inspiration. I'll write it on post-traumatic growth. And what are the things that help somebody, maybe from your own experience, the people you've spoken to, the stories you've heard, that help somebody at this fork in the road to sort of see, well, post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic growth, what is it helps a person to take one fork of the road rather than other, if indeed we can make a choice like that?
I'll just briefly mention as well, because you've mentioned the OMS movement, which is what it is now, a global movement. You know, George and Linda are not the only ones who are recovering and or living well with MS. Like anybody who is following those programs will tell you what an incredible opportunity is there. You know, it's all laid out. And I remember meeting a group of people that I call the OMS All-Stars, you know, a group of people who are really smart, really engaged people who all were diagnosed with MS and who all were able to overcome MS. I mean, you know, this is something that the mainstream medical community, slowly that's starting to come around, but the truth is that, you know, somebody diagnosed with MS today is basically, you know, not told that there's so many things that they can do. So in terms of the hope and the conviction, you know, I think we also need to be honest with ourselves about falling off the bandwagon. Because that, you know, recovery is not necessarily a straight path, which doesn't make for good journalism. Because it's going to be a really boring movie if I tell you, you know, then I tried this and then I tried that and then I started eating that again, and like it's just, that doesn't work. It's a nice neat little story with a bow on top. But so I guess that's the other thing. The other message is that it's okay to try and fail, and it doesn't mean that, you know, to give up, and just to keep trying every single day. And in some ways that's the hard work, because, you know, I've written 2 books, I've made 2 films, podcasts, blogs. I do this for my job, and I still find it really hard to stay on track. And I have to decide every single day to stay on track and not fall back into my old habits. So yeah, yes, walk down the road, take the fork, the path. What's the beautiful the path untraveled? Craig, you'll know the reference. Take that path, take it, but also keep taking it.
Well, I think there's I think it might have been a 19th century politician by the name of Burke who said the condition upon which freedom is granted is eternal vigilance. He was talking about politics and freedom in society, but I suspect in terms of healthcare as well, you know, that there's a certain, this conscious moment by moment decision rather than, oh, tick that box, done for all time. I don't think life kind of works like that.
You know, my favorite of all the bodies of work that I've looked at, you know, everything from habit science to, you know, diet, I've looked at everything in depth, I love reading academic peer-reviewed papers. But do you know, my favorite body of research is this whole group of people studying conscientiousness. And it's so boring. It is so boring. But the key to being well, regardless of whether you've been diagnosed with a mental illness or a chronic disease, or if you haven't been diagnosed with anything, the single most important thing you can do is have commitment and consistency. Conscientiousness. It's not going to be a best-selling book. It's not going to make me millions of dollars, but it's the truth.
The lovers of alliteration, I just love 3 C's. There we go.
Exactly. Yep.
In terms of the stories that you tell, are you conscious of there being a lesson or a theme or something behind the story that you're bringing to light, or are you completely neutral as far as that's concerned? Just present the story and let anybody else draw whatever conclusions they draw from it.
It's a bit of both. I think I came from a school of journalism in which we were taught to really strive for objectivity at all costs. And as a sidebar to that, that was a generation of journalism that I think really failed on climate reporting. Mm-hmm. Because that sort of school of journalism was that, if somebody says, the world is heating up, then you've got to find somebody who says the world isn't heating up. You might have 99 people saying the world is heating up, but you give that one person the equal amount of voice, which means that the public then perceives it as a debate, which it actually wasn't. It was never that. There's nuanced debate within it, but so now, as having been in the industry for 25 years, I don't think that there is such a thing as objectivity, but I do think, Craig, this is where my more mature mindfulness practice is actually informing all the work that I'm doing now, which is that it's just this constant asking of why this story, why now, and having a very deep committed practice is really helps me answer that a lot. Yeah, I mean, we can go into that in more depth if you want to, but it's going to take us down a different direction.
So that kind of helps you to sort of calibrate yourself, to have that self-awareness, to see what's influencing or motivating
exactly
questions you ask, etc.
Exactly. And just to give you an example of with Raising Superheroes, that project, I could very easily a year and a half ago have put out a great film which said, here are the top 10 tips for parents to, raise kids in a happy, healthy way. And we could have visited all the countries in the world that have got happy children. There could have been a really great case study of this kid living in Japan and this kid living in the Netherlands and this kid living in Vanuatu. And it would have been a lovely, beautiful, happy story. And this is where my mindfulness is really coming into it. I don't think that story ultimately would really genuinely change things. For kids, for example, here in Australia who are suffering. I think it would have been nice, and I think there would have been parents who loved it and enjoyed it and got a lot from it. But I don't, and this is really the work that I'm doing now. And as I kind of get into the second half of my career, I really want to tell a story that's actually going to change. It's going to make a difference. Yeah.
That's impactful storytelling wakes people up, changes lives. I mean, journalists have got an enormously important role to play in the community. And like a lot of professions that have important roles, oftentimes denigrated or criticised, etc. But I know how conscientious you are about good quality journalism. What are some of the elements you would say? I mean, you've referred to evidence as well. What are the real hallmarks or qualities of really good journalism, the kind of journalism that the world needs and it's going to make the world a better place?
Gosh, I guess there's 3 things that come to mind. Rigor is and it's never, for me, the research, there's never enough research. there's always more to research. So rigor is number one. Two is talent, because I tell visual stories in documentary form and podcasts and things. So you've got to have good talent, people who can articulate it beautifully. And in that, I would sort of wrap around a really compelling story. But more and more, I'm interested in a movement called solutions journalism, because you would notice this in the current reporting climate. A lot of what gets clicked on, the term clickbait, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, is doom journalism. It's like problem journalism. And some of our, so this is not to say that I'm hugely critical of investigative reporting in Australia at the moment, because I think that it's really important that we have great investigative reporting. But the KPI on investigative reporting in some organizations is that somebody loses their job. And if somebody's lost their job as a result of this reporting, or we've taken down a ministry, or we've taken down a, government organization, that is the measure of success. Whereas what I'm interested in is the kind of reporting that presents how we solve the problem, so embedding that solution within the problem itself. So it's a very, I'm not sure if this audience in particular wants to hear about all the problems in journalism at the moment, but I can talk forever on it.
Well, we often talk in healthcare about an illness focus or an illness model rather than a wellness focus or wellness model, and it seems like in some ways that happens in journalism as well. Megan, welcome back. Now, take some time for some questions as well, and I'll be interested to hear what kinds of things that our viewers are interested to ask you, Shannon.
Well, just on that last journalism question, there were people agreeing there's loads of polarization in stories in the media, especially in the Middle East and US politics at the moment. How do you bring mindfulness to covering those kinds of stories? Which I think you answered a little bit with talking about the kind of journalism you favor, but is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think if people are interested though, they should definitely Google solutions journalism. And it is a real movement that's happening around the world. So, and there's people like me, whatever their speciality is, are interested in it. So particularly, for example, the Middle East, there is some solutions journalism happening on that topic. So I recommend people do a search on it. Yeah.
Brilliant. And someone else has just asked, I'd love to hear more about Shannon's mindfulness practice, if possible, please.
Well, there's a film that people can watch called My Year of Living Mindfully. And that's a good starting place. There's also a book that people can read on it. So perhaps that, as we won't have time necessarily to go into that today, but that might be good.
But you do practice meditation every day, and
Yes.
you practice being mindful as you go about your day-to-day life. It's not I did the film, tick that box, leave it behind now.
Absolutely not. No. I have a very robust daily practice, and try to get on silent retreats whenever I can. Yeah, mindfulness is a very big part of my life. Yep. Still.
We had two people, Emily and Michelle, as soon as you mentioned that paper of Craig's quite early in your conversation, they're like, can we please have the name of Craig's paper and document that was the springboard for your inquiry into health and healing? And is it possible to get a copy of Craig's paper that Shannon referenced? Craig, you've published a lot of papers since then, but if we're able to dig that out, I think we could potentially share that, or maybe some other research that might be useful for people to explore that.
Well, I think that paper is these days a bit of a historical document. I mean, going back a few years, and it's probably as old as the Dead Sea Scrolls by now, I'd say. But
I've kept my copy of it with all of its highlights and all of its little tabs and everything. I keep it in my cupboard right here because it's so special to me.
Yeah, that paper formed a foundation for a book called The Essence of Health.
Mm.
And Essence just satisfied my love of acronyms. So, but it covers all sorts of things in lifestyle and the mind-body area. So I'd refer to the Essence of Health book, and that would kind of expand that paper, which was about 80 pages long, I think, but expands it quite a lot more.
Lovely. Natalie's just asked if Shannon can recommend any silent retreats.
My teacher's name is Patrick Carney. Google him, Patrick Carney.
Not to be confused with the drummer for the Black Keys. Patrick Carney. They're two different Patrick Carneys, just in case anyone Googles that and gets confused.
You thought you're going for a silent retreat and you got a drummer. I mean, that would be, oh, well.
But yeah, I practice a form of silent retreat called insight meditation. That's the one that I've found really interesting. But there's a guide on my website called A Beginner's Guide to Starting a Mindfulness Practice, which could be also helpful for people who are interested. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, that is my cue to direct you all to Shannon's website, shannonharvey.com. You can see loads of great information. There are links to watch clips. You've got loads of beautiful resources on there as well. And also where you can get access to her films and her books that she's written. It's all really wonderful, wonderful information. So Shannon, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. And I just also, I know we need to wrap up, but the work that is going on there at M3CS is absolutely extraordinary. Like, not just these public forums, if that's what people are aware of, great, fantastic, but the research that's happening behind the scenes, the programs that are on offer, it's such a game changer, this organisation, for the landscape here in Australia and globally. And it's just, I'm so thrilled to be, cheering you guys on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. We couldn't be more thankful. And I really look forward to seeing your next documentary and meeting a few superheroes.